Hey everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to another Stukent Expert Session. Today we are excited to bring on Dustin Stout to teach us about the basic principles of creating stunning visual content. Dustin is an entrepreneur, digital marketing consultant, as well as a popular writer and speaker on social media marketing and visual content design. Over the years, Dustin has had the chance to work with some great brands and was named as one of the top 10 social media blogs by Social Media Examiner. Currently, he is a part owner and co-founder of Warfare Plugins, as well as Visual Content Mastery, which teaches non-designers how to create eye-catching, highly effective visual content for social media and blogs. So without further ado, I'll turn the time over to you, Dustin.
I'm really happy to be here, always happy to talk about design, and specifically we're talking about visual content, which is different than any standard graphic design. Graphic design or design is the bigger topic. Visual content is usually what I refer to when talking about images, graphics, videos, and things, all things visual created for websites and social media. So today I'll be sort of focusing on the social media side of things, and I'll get this presentation here going. So today I would love to teach you how to create visual content that doesn't suck. Now, we all know that in social media today, visuals are king. And you scroll through your Facebook feed, the first thing that catches your eye is a photograph or an image. You scroll through Pinterest and it's nothing but images. And on visual platforms like Pinterest or Facebook or Instagram, good visuals are the winners, and ugly visuals are, I'm sorry to say, are the losers. So I want to help those who are listening today and the students around the world how to create visual content that stands out, that gets you noticed, that gets you the credibility and the credit you deserve, and doesn't get drowned out by all the drabby visual content out there. Because there's a lot of it. There's a lot of non-designers out there trying to create visuals because they know it will get them attention, but they have no clue what goes into a great visual. And so the objective here, as I said, is I want to teach you just 3 basic design principles, just 3. That's all you really need to get a firm foundation in creating good visual content. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll walk out and head over to your graphic design software of choice, be that Canva or PicMonkey or Stencil or Photoshop, and create some awesome, beautiful visuals that you can share on social media. So the first concept is balance. Now, psychologically, in my course, I talk a lot about the psychology of design, but many of us know, or have at least seen some studies done, that the human brain associates symmetry with beauty. The more symmetrical someone's face is, the more beautiful we naturally, instinctively think that they are. So balance and symmetry is a very important key when creating visual content for social media, blogs, and other things. So like I said, our brains are programmed to see symmetry as beauty. And so in the world of social media and content online, typically visuals follow this same similar pattern. There's a background or there's a photograph, and then we put some text or some logos or some calls to action over top of that photo. So I'm going to start here with a photo. And you'll notice that this photograph, it's pretty symmetrical, right? It's like almost weirdly symmetrical. It's like a mirrored image. So by symmetrical, I mean it's the same on the left and the right and the top and the bottom. Everything is sort of perfectly in its place. Now, I want you to start visualizing every time you see a photograph that you're going to put some text on and use on social media. I want you to envision sort of a crosshair going horizontally and vertically to the center. You notice I put that on the screen for you to sort of visualize. This is going to help you create and position your elements in the layout in a balanced way. So we see, again, this image exactly the same top and bottom, left and right. So if we were going to put some text or a logo on top of this, where might you think that we are going to place that in order to keep that perfect, beautiful symmetry? If you said right dead center, then you're absolutely right. To center and balance this image, we want to make the text the same alignment, the same positioning, so as to not mess up the balance of that image, if that makes sense. So I know what you're thinking, but Dustin, what if the image isn't perfectly symmetrical? Most images and photographs are not. I hear you, and I'm very glad you asked. So let's take this photograph for as an example. Now, it's what we would consider asymmetrical, where the left and the right and the top and the bottom is not in anywhere close to the same. But every photograph and every background that you see has 2 or 3 elements, the background, the foreground, and the subject. And this one, we really just have a sort of a background and a subject. The subject of this particular photograph happens to be the car. It's the closest thing, it's the biggest thing, it's the most heavy thing. So what we want to do is put those crosshairs on there again and divide up this image in our minds, visualize this and say, okay, if the subject, the heaviest focal point of this image is on the left and sort of down to the right, or down to the left, I'm sorry, where would we want to put text to sort of balance this out? And in this scenario, you would probably want to balance it out sort of like a set of scales. You got a heavy on one side, you want to balance it out on the other side. So we would put that text in the bottom right hand corner to balance out that heavy element. So asymmetry, which is when things are not perfectly the same top and bottom, left and right, is just as beautiful as asymmetry. Asymmetry can be just as beautiful as symmetry, as you can see. So let's look at some other examples of how this can be applied, the idea of balance. So we've got a hand holding a cup, and if we visually divide that up, we'll notice the focal point, the subject is the cup, and again, we want to balance the text element or the logo element in the bottom right-hand corner to give that balance and symmetry. Likewise, we have a beautiful image of a pier and some water, the water being the empty white space, the pier being sort of the subject. We divide that up and we see, oh, the bottom left-hand corner is empty, and we would put our text and logo element there. Same thing with this photo. This photo is actually pretty symmetrical, and if you divide it up in the middle, you see the subject up top, that big, beautiful, destroyed building or whatever, and then the empty space with the sand. So we would balance that out with the text and logo element at the bottom, centered, just like that subject is centered. Balance gives visual stability to your images, and lack of balance therefore gives an impression of instability. So when people look at images, the first thing, their brains are working so fast. Your brain is working so fast as every time I flip a slide, you're interpreting the thing so fast that, I mean, it's immeasurable. So when you give someone balance and stability, their instant impression is that it's professional and that it was intentionally laid out. Now, the next element that we're going to talk about is framing. Now, what in the world is framing? No, I'm not talking about what Roger Rabbit had to deal with. Framing, it's like what I like to call non-negotiable white space. And think about the things in your life that you see in every day. You walk through a doorway, you see a painting, your windows. All these things have these sort of frames. Why is that? Well, it's because when things don't have a frame, they feel constricting. And so in the world of visual content, we want to create an invisible frame in our minds, just like we envision that crosshair over top of the images to sort of split it up and help us balance it. We're going to learn to create an invisible frame around the outermost part of our images. And that's going to give them a nice framed area, which is, in my opinion, should be untouchable by any other elements. And let me show you exactly what I mean by this. Back to the image of the car and the text. Now notice where the mock-up text and logo is placed. There is some white space between the edge of the text and the edge of the image on the far rightmost part of the image where it ends, and then the bottom. Look how it's nice and crisp and even. That's because we've taken this, we've superimposed in our minds an invisible frame to give it a set structure and some white space to sort of separate the edge from the actual elements we want people to focus on, giving them some visual breathing room, if you will. Let's look at some other examples of this. Again, creating that white space, a frame. A general rule of thumb is you want it to be 10% of the overall width. So the left frame, or in web design we call it padding or margin, would be 10% of the full width of that element. And you want it to be the same all the way around. It creates just this beautiful intentional layout. So I wanted to give you a live example because, well, live examples are good. It's always easier to show than to tell. So let's imagine this this blank slate. This is an image. Now this is, you're gonna have to put on your metaphorical glasses. Imagine this is just a background image. You've got a lighter subject in the top right, a darker, heavier subject in the bottom, or top left, sorry, and the heavier object down in the bottom right. Let's say I was creating a blog graphic that I wanted to share on social media. So I've got this element on the left that's sort of the what it's about: 29 social posts, 7 social networks, 5 minutes or less, what? Then I've got the big caption near the center. It's kind of off center. Got my logo in the top right, and then a link down in the bottom left. It's like kind of all over the place. And notice how that top left in particular feels kind of constricting, almost like your eyes don't even want to pay attention to it because it's too close to the edge and it feels kind of claustrophobic. Now notice when I flip slides here, it's slightly changed. I've created a sort of invisible frame that you can tell these have been positioned intentionally. And let me just kind of break it down for you here. 100 pixels is sort of the frame that I was working with here, and you'll notice every single element that comes close to an edge is the same distance from those edges as the other elements on the page, creating this beautiful, nice framework and layout. And that's essentially framing. Framing your content gives you sufficient visual breathing room for your viewers. And a lack of framing constricts, causes tension, gives people that claustrophobic, and people are actually visually repelled by things that feel constricting or cause tension. And the last concept that I'm going to talk about here is usually the most difficult for people to understand, so it really necessitates some visual identification, and that's contrast. Contrast is the degree of visible differentiation between elements. And this is a lot of times you'll hear people say like, something about it just doesn't pop. I want it to pop, make it pop. One of those trigger phrases for designers like me when they hear that. Essentially contrast, the closer the elements are in their color and brightness, the lower the contrast is. And the lower the contrast, the harder they are to distinguish. So let me show you exactly what that means. So let's look at this image. This is straight from Wikipedia on the definition of contrast. On the left side of this image, you'll notice it seems kind of grayer and not as crisp in its colors. And on the right side, much more crisp. Those colors are much more differentiated. The left would be a low contrast resolution, and the right side would be a high contrast. And let me show you a little bit more what this looks like in the world of adding text. So these boxes are examples of very bad contrast. On the leftmost box, the black one, the background is black, the text is a little bit darker black, and it's almost hard to read because the contrast is so low, the colors are too close together. Same with the red, and the worst one is probably the far right with the gray background and the white text. So you want to be aware of the background and the text that you're creating, that it's legible, that people actually can differentiate between the colors and read what it is you're saying. So here's a real life example using the same text that we used in the last example. You'll notice in the top left, the white and the yellow text just kind of disappears into the fog of the background, right? And that makes it very difficult to read. In fact, it's so difficult, and our brains make decisions so quickly that we would probably ignore that text altogether in the world of social media and fast-paced visuals. We wouldn't even read it. So what's the point of it even being there? So in design and in creating your visuals, whatever tool you use, you want to use some techniques in which to boost that contrast, to make it a little bit easier to read. So one method that I like to use a lot is simply by putting a transparent layer of black in between the text and the background. And you can see just putting that semi-transparent layer in there boosts the contrast. You can actually read what it says now, and it's not as repelling to the eyes. Contrast is not only critical for basic legibility, just for reading it, but for the color impaired. I bet most of you didn't know that 1 out of 12 men and 1 out of 200 women are actually colorblind. And so we want to really pay attention to visual contrast. And if you're not familiar with color blindness, somebody who is a certain type, there's multiple types of different colorblind degrees and levels and types of color blindness. There are those who would look at this image and they wouldn't be able to distinguish that there's actually a number in there. They wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two colors because of their color blindness. And that's because the contrast of these two colors is too close. The degree of brightness is too close, and they wouldn't be able to distinguish it. On a website, this was actually a friend's website. He's given me permission to show this because I've corrected him and it doesn't look like this anymore. But sometimes when you use bright colors together in the same area, it almost acts, for those of us who have our full visual capacities, it acts as a repellent. If you're looking at the screen, I don't know how well the resolution comes through, but that bright blue background and that bright red together, it almost feels kind of painful to look at for those of us who are a little bit more sensitive on the spectrum. So you want to be very careful in not mixing too many high contrast, high luminosity, high brightness colors together, because that will actually repel people from using. That's just a little note to the wise. Sometimes just because your call to action is red doesn't mean it's the right color based on the background. So as a quick review here, we talked about balance, give your images visual stability, as well as psychologically associate them with beauty. We talked about framing, give your audience visual breathing room to take in your content. And we talked about contrast briefly. Make sure your message is legible and it isn't repelling people's eyes. And I am Dustin W. Stout. That's my pretty face there on the right, and creator of visual content course, blogger at dustn.tv. And you can follow me on the socials if that's your thing.